Shocking news at Ferrari. Frederic Vasseur has been fired with immediate effect to make way for Christian Horner's arrival. If you want to know everything about his private meeting with Lewis Hamilton, don't miss a second of this video. It's made for you. Following a prolonged stretch of instability and rising discord within the corridors of Scuderia Ferrari, the team reached a critical juncture that few outside observers saw coming. The removal of Frederic Vasseur from his role at the helm was not merely a reaction to fluctuating race day performances. It was the culmination of internal unease, strategic gridlock, and a deteriorating balance between two elite competitors sharing the same garage. Senior figures inside Ferrari's hierarchy had grown increasingly uneasy, not only about the direction of the car's development or the team's inability to convert potential into podiums, but more profoundly about the silent war playing out between Lewis Hamilton and Charles Leclerc. That escalating tension, subtle yet destructive, was infecting everything from decision-making processes to long-term planning, creating an unsustainable environment that left Ferrari's leadership with no viable path forward other than a full reset at the top. What emerged from this internal reckoning wasn't a cosmetic change or a superficial reshuffling of roles. Instead, Ferrari made a daring move that stunned much of the Formula One paddock. They extended an offer to one of the most divisive yet effective leaders in the sport's modern era, Christian Horner. Accepting the challenge meant leaving behind his long-standing tenure at Red Bull, where he had carved out an identity as a tactical mastermind and institutional builder. His arrival in Italy didn't just represent a change in leadership, it signaled the beginning of a paradigm shift. Horner brought with him not just credibility and accolades, but a willingness to dismantle long-standing allegiances and start anew. He wasn't interested in managing egos, he was determined to install order, reimagine structure, and inject clarity where there had been confusion. From his first moments inside Maranello, Horner made it unmistakably clear that he had no interest in maintaining illusions of parity where imbalance had taken root. His strategic vision revolved around elevating Hamilton as the primary driver in the team's championship quest, not out of favoritism, but as a logical step based on data, experience, and reliability under pressure. Though politically sensitive, this decision reflected his belief in building around consistency, resilience, and elite pedigree. Horner knew what it took to win in the modern age of Formula One. He had seen Hamilton's strengths up close for years, often from the opposite side of a championship battle, and now he intended to channel those very qualities in service of Ferrari's long-elusive goal of returning to the summit of the sport. Recognizing that trust was fragile and perhaps irreparably damaged, Horner took immediate steps to repair it, not through public statements or hollow reassurances, but in private, meaningful dialogue. He requested a one-on-one session with Hamilton, a meeting held far from the public eye, secluded within the deeper recesses of the team's operational center. The mood was serious, the conversation uninterrupted by handlers or advisors. There, in that isolated room, Horner confirmed what Hamilton had long suspected but could never prove definitively. He spoke candidly about the existence of internal biases, systemic choices made by influential voices within the engineering division that had gradually shifted the focus of car development, data flow, and feedback loops toward Leclerc. These weren't random fluctuations. They were coordinated patterns embedded in technical procedures and resource allocations, designed to maintain Leclerc's grip on team influence. Horner didn't just offer vague admissions. He identified the areas where sabotage had crept in, subtle discrepancies in simulation access, intentional delays in upgrade packages, pre-race debriefs that prioritized one set of information while marginalizing another. It wasn't sabotage in the dramatic sense, but it was structured exclusion, crafted carefully enough to avoid detection but potent enough to skew outcomes across multiple race weekends. For Hamilton, who had sensed the erosion of trust and parity for some time, the revelations were simultaneously infuriating and relieving. It wasn't paranoia, it was reality. And now someone at the very top was willing to confront it without deflection. What followed was not a promise of special treatment, but an ironclad guarantee that those behind the manipulation would be held accountable. Horner laid out a plan for structural reorganization, streamlining communication lines, removing redundancies, and reassigning technical personnel who had allowed their loyalties to compromise the team's competitive integrity. From that point forward, every dataset would be fully shared, every setup decision mutually reviewed, and every strategic call made with transparency and competitive fairness. Hamilton would no longer be left to interpret cryptic messages or questionable pit calls. He would be equipped with every available tool and afforded the respect that his track record demanded. At the same time, Horner began recalibrating the team's long-term trajectory. Leclerc, though still immensely talented and valued, would be expected to compete on level terms without the insulation he had previously enjoyed. The structure of favoritism that had quietly flourished beneath the surface would be dismantled piece by piece. There would be no more silent vetoes over car setup, no more off-the-books consultation steering development in one direction, and no more shadow hierarchies influencing weekend outcomes. Every driver, engineer, and strategist would now report to a system governed by performance metrics, not internal politics. This internal transformation extended beyond the drivers. Horner understood that Ferrari's identity had to evolve, that clinging to romantic notions of legacy would only slow down the mission at hand. He introduced a results-first culture that valued efficiency, data-driven planning, and cohesion. The team's entire technical department was reviewed, with fresh audits conducted on the aero division, power unit development cycles, and the correlation between simulator findings and track reality. Recruitment processes were tightened. Roles were clarified. Ambiguity was eliminated. Everyone within the organization, from junior mechanics to senior advisors, now operated under a single non-negotiable mandate: return Ferrari to its rightful place at the top of Formula One, or be replaced by someone who could. The stakes were raised. Tolerance for compromise was reduced to zero. Horner's message to the paddock, even if not delivered aloud, became unmistakably clear. Ferrari was no longer going to be the team of missed chances, emotional favoritism, or legacy politics. It would instead become an entity built around accountability, clarity, and ruthless focus. For Hamilton, this meant finally stepping into a structure where his contributions were not just acknowledged, but leveraged. For the rest of the grid, it meant that Ferrari was no longer divided. It had chosen a path. And it was no longer looking back. Leclerc had been operating with hardware refinements and software strategies that Hamilton never knew existed. Hidden within the routine updates and performance summaries, several core systems had been discreetly altered on Leclerc's car alone. The most crucial of these was a fundamentally restructured rear suspension module, subtly adjusted to provide improved damping response and cornering stability at high yaw angles. The configuration allowed Leclerc to preserve tire life under stress, particularly during heavy lateral loads on circuits like Suzuka and Silverstone. None of this had been disclosed to Hamilton's side of the garage, not in engineering briefings, not in pre-weekend documentation, and certainly not in real-time data distribution. Technical logs obtained through unofficial channels revealed selective data streams. Certain telemetry outputs, particularly those related to traction metrics, regenerative braking phases, and lateral g-force thresholds, had been flagged for internal review and quietly redirected away from Hamilton's data pool. This created a deceptive parity in post-session analysis. Hamilton's engineers were reviewing incomplete models, drawing conclusions from truncated inputs, while Leclerc's crew had full visibility into the adaptive behavior of the new configuration under real conditions. The discrepancy was invisible on the surface, but devastating in its long-term effect. Even more alarming was the software-side asymmetry in the deployment of hybrid power. While the regulations mandated a standardized energy recovery system across both cars, internal maps had been subtly tweaked. Leclerc's ERS unit was programmed with a variable release protocol, dynamically adjusting output based on micro-telemetry triggers. This granted him bursts of kinetic output at optimal exit points, especially in sectors requiring rapid throttle re-engagement. On Hamilton's machine, that protocol had been disabled under the pretense of drivability preservation, a rationale repeated so frequently it had lost meaning. In hindsight, it was a cover, an engineered limitation wrapped in technocratic language. What Hamilton found most unsettling wasn't merely the asymmetry, it was the careful orchestration behind it. A small cluster of performance analysts, software architects, and powertrain specialists had formed what could only be described as a parallel development track, reporting selectively to senior management. This shadow group had direct input on Leclerc's development pathway, while maintaining a facade of technical impartiality to the wider team. Meetings had been scheduled with only one set of engineers. Internal performance reviews had been split, with Leclerc receiving targeted simulator upgrades that were intentionally withheld from Car 44's development cycle. The moment Horner placed the compiled evidence in Hamilton's hands, it all came into focus. A confidential report stretching over 140 pages cataloged the systemic biases, differential tire compound recommendations, asymmetric aero package trials, even selective pit stop simulations that consistently predicted optimal strategies for Leclerc, never for both. These weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns, repeatable and traceable. Some of the contributors to the dossier were longtime Ferrari staffers. Others were recent hires brought in during Hamilton's recruitment, now disillusioned by the culture they found embedded in the organization. They detailed moments where Hamilton's input in technical sessions was disregarded outright, or worse, dismissed with condescension masked as pragmatism. Reading through the dossier, Hamilton experienced a quiet, mounting realization. His questions over throttle lag, his instinctual discomfort with corner entry feedback, his confusion over tire deltas during stints, they hadn't been flaws in his understanding. They had been signs. Signals he had ignored out of trust, out of hope, out of belief that a team so steeped in tradition would never actively sabotage its own chance at success. He had chalked it up to teething problems, to adaptation curves, to a complex car needing time to tame. Now he understood. The system had been tilted from the start. Horner didn't approach the issue with apologies. He spoke plainly, with the controlled urgency of someone who had uncovered something deeply wrong and could no longer stomach it. He explained how he had been alerted to anomalies in development allocation, how requests for parity in hardware distribution had been consistently bypassed by mid-level staffers with discretionary control. He revealed that telemetry filters had been used to create artificial parity in pre-race briefings, masking real performance gaps as driver preference variance. He confirmed that the imbalance had not only cost Hamilton competitive results, but may have influenced long-term decisions about car direction that were still being felt across both chassis. But more than just acknowledging the sabotage, Horner took action. He had already removed several key figures responsible for the biased data control. A new oversight structure was being implemented, eliminating departmental silos and mandating cross-car testing for every new component, regardless of the driver. Strategy simulation tools would now run blind comparisons between both vehicles, with no names attached, preventing unconscious bias from seeping into tactical calls. All radio communications would be logged and archived for post-race review, and all race weekend engineering debriefs would include both drivers and their full technical teams. For Hamilton, the emotional toll was staggering. He had sacrificed so much to wear the red suit, to lead Ferrari back to glory not through favoritism, but through discipline, performance, and legacy. To learn that behind the iconic livery and the public displays of unity, there had been an invisible wall, one that bent every decision, every upgrade, every ounce of progress in favor of someone else, was more than betrayal. It was heartbreak. He had believed in the project, trusted the promise, even defended the team in media scrums when results faltered. Now, all those moments replayed in his mind with cruel clarity. But Hamilton was not defeated. Shock gave way to resolve. Horner's transparency, the bravery of the engineers who spoke out, and the changes being set in motion lit a different kind of fire in him. He wasn't just racing for wins anymore. He was racing to reclaim control of his own narrative, to prove that when given equal footing, no one could touch him. The silence that followed in the room was not one of despair, but of reorientation. The path ahead was clear. The deception was over. Now came the reckoning. In the days that ensued, Christian Horner set into motion a wide-ranging recalibration of Ferrari's internal machinery, an initiative designed not merely to shuffle personnel but to alter the very ecosystem that had, for too long, fostered division, complacency, and unequal treatment. Almost immediately, he began phasing out several high-level engineers and department leads whose technical philosophies had long revolved around Charles Leclerc's preferences. These weren't incidental dismissals. They marked a deliberate attempt to break entrenched power structures and realign the team around objectivity and unified execution. These individuals had, over the years, formed unofficial alliances within the organization, skewing developmental trajectories and creating blind spots in the team's strategic vision. Their removal created both tension and clarity, an essential reset to eliminate the quiet favoritism that had seeped into the fabric of operations. With surgical precision, Horner brought in a group of aerodynamic analysts who had previously collaborated with him during his Red Bull tenure. Though no longer full-time employees of any single team, these contractors were specialists known for their forensic approach to downforce behavior, airflow coherence, and corner entry turbulence. Their role was to dismantle the existing aero model layer by layer, identifying weak points not visible through traditional data collection, and to refine it based on empirical testing rather than hypothesis. Their work led to a redefinition of the rear stability parameters and the placement of new vortex-generating elements intended to reduce drag oscillation at high-speed transitions. This level of detailed focus had rarely been seen before within Ferrari's design office, which had often prioritized top-line innovation over iterative refinement. In tandem, Horner re-engineered how driver feedback was collected, interpreted, and integrated into the car development loop. Under the prior system, each driver's side of the garage operated semi-independently, resulting in diverging interpretations of telemetry, simulation analysis, and tire degradation patterns. Horner viewed this bifurcation as detrimental to progress. He mandated a shared telemetry suite for both sides of the garage, merging the analytical models so that discrepancies in behavior, throttle modulation, and suspension load could be understood contextually rather than in isolation. He also introduced a joint debrief format wherein both drivers would participate in identical data reviews, ensuring that neither could influence technical direction unilaterally without the other's perspective being heard and scrutinized. The simulator program underwent a complete overhaul. Previously, the virtual modeling was customized to reflect the driving preferences of each pilot, resulting in subtle discrepancies in the computational simulations that informed upgrades. Under Horner's direction, the simulator inputs were standardized, and new algorithms were introduced to reflect real-world aerodynamic turbulence and track evolution with greater fidelity. The objective was to ensure that every lap completed in the virtual car mimicked the real vehicle as closely as computational physics would allow, eliminating data anomalies and ensuring each driver entered a race weekend with equally accurate predictions and expectations. This harmonized model helped bridge a long-standing gap in preparation quality between the drivers and signaled the end of preferential calibration. One of the most impactful operational shifts was the creation of a centralized upgrade dissemination system. In the past, modifications, particularly those deemed non-critical, were often delivered asynchronously or with selective emphasis, allowing for unequal preparation windows and asymmetric strategic interpretation. Horner changed that permanently. Every aerodynamic evolution, mechanical alteration, or control system tweak would now be shared concurrently with both drivers, accompanied by comprehensive briefing documents, graphical simulations, and time series data forecasting the component's influence on lap consistency and tire conservation. These meetings were tightly structured, with engineers required to address both pilots directly and document every question raised in order to build a shared archive of development rationale. Parallel to these structural adjustments, Horner took a hands-on role in reassessing the underlying physical characteristics of the SF25. While prior technical reviews had labeled the car's balance issues as setup-dependent or tire-sensitive, Horner suspected a deeper mechanical flaw. He authorized a multi-phase diagnostic program to explore torsional flexibility, structural harmonics under heavy braking, and lateral energy dispersion during load shifts. What emerged from the findings was a clearer understanding that the central spine of the chassis lacked the rigidity needed to support aggressive mid-corner transitions, particularly those demanded by Hamilton's driving habits. A design philosophy that had favored smoother, more progressive rotation was found to be fundamentally misaligned with Hamilton's instinctual sharp entries and fast rotation sequences. Acting on this, Horner initiated the development of a new underbody profile with altered pressure channeling to maintain consistent downforce under lateral yaw. A reimagined floor construction was paired with a flexible diffuser edge that allowed the car to retain aerodynamic grip even during off-balance transitions. The design, though still in its prototyping stage, showed immediate promise during closed-circuit testing and provided Hamilton with a significantly more predictable rear-end behavior through quick changes of direction. These weren't cosmetic adjustments. They were fundamental to reshaping how the car transferred load and maintained stability under Hamilton's preferred driving constraints. During an extended debrief in the engineering suite, Horner sat down with Hamilton to dissect every aspect of the new configuration. Together, they walked through interactive simulations, onboard overlays, and comparative modeling against prior setups. For the first time since arriving in Maranello, Hamilton was not merely presented with a car tailored to Leclerc's baseline, but instead saw tangible evidence that the vehicle was being rebuilt with his needs fully embedded in the engineering process. The tone of the conversation wasn't promotional, it was analytical, data-backed, and unapologetically detailed. In this exchange, something shifted. The intangible distance Hamilton had long felt from Ferrari's core engineering leadership began to dissolve. He wasn't simply being accommodated, he was being integrated into the decision-making chain with the same authority and technical weight that he had previously held at Mercedes during their most dominant years. The change wasn't emotional, it was procedural. For a driver who had built his legacy on trust in the tools provided to him, this new framework represented not just a performance boost but a psychological realignment. Meanwhile, Leclerc began experiencing the ramifications of this transformation in a subtler but no less significant way. The implicit biases that had once tilted development timelines and component delivery schedules in his favor were now subject to rigid egalitarian oversight. Strategic ambiguity was being replaced by procedural clarity. Instead of quiet influence, he was now operating within a strictly codified system where his inputs were weighed equally, but no longer disproportionately. The technical balance of power had shifted, not toward one driver, but toward a neutral standard that respected both. Nightly debriefs became intensely collaborative. Tire wear models, brake bias overlays, and downforce maps were reviewed by both drivers simultaneously, cross-analyzed with AI-assisted telemetry interpreters that flagged driving differentials, gear shift anomalies, and torque inefficiencies in real time. The old pattern of selectively tailoring information streams was dismantled entirely. Now all adjustments, whether mechanical or aerodynamic, were benchmarked against both drivers' telemetry, with no room for ambiguity or private experimentation outside approved development windows. The cultural change was just as striking as the technical one. Meetings once dominated by tribal loyalties and silent tension now emphasized shared understanding, strategic foresight, and evidence-based debate. Even the engineering language evolved. Instead of referring to Hamilton's balance or Leclerc's grip window, they began to speak in terms of car-wide behavior models, signaling a shift toward unification rather than personalization. The car was no longer two machines disguised as one, it was a singular platform with dual inputs. And in that restructured environment, Hamilton found the foundation he had been seeking for nearly 2 seasons, not merely belief in his own ability, but confirmation that the organization behind him was finally catching up to his standard. Every sensor, every actuator, every line of code was now responding to the same philosophy of equality, detail, and accountability. And that, for a driver used to winning not through politics but through precision, was the clearest signal yet that Ferrari was no longer operating in fragments, but as one. Over time, the atmosphere surrounding Charles Leclerc became noticeably strained. Conversations that used to take place openly among his closest allies now occurred behind closed doors, muffled and cautious. Personnel changes, previously rare and strategic, began to occur more frequently, and almost always without his consultation. Individuals who had once been considered integral to his day-to-day operations, data analysts who knew his driving preferences by instinct, support staff who understood the nuances of his temperament, were either reassigned to other departments or replaced altogether by faces with no historic loyalty. It was no longer just a matter of internal restructuring, it was a redefinition of influence, unfolding quietly yet intentionally. Leclerc, whose comfort within the walls of Ferrari had once been unshakable, began to sense a growing disconnect between himself and the decision-makers steering the ship. The changes were not overtly hostile, but they were impossible to ignore. Invitations to technical briefings that he once led were now co-hosted, sometimes entirely overseen by newer voices. Strategy sessions, once built around his instincts and feedback, began to feature more rigid agendas that left less room for spontaneity or emotional intelligence. He could feel the shift in the energy around him. What had once felt like a tailored experience now resembled a standardized procedure. His influence, though still present, no longer felt paramount. Those closest to the process could see the recalibration. Engineers began deferring less to his preferences. Communications became more formal. And while no direct confrontation ever occurred, the change in tone was undeniable. Observers within the paddock, always adept at picking up the slightest tremors in team dynamics, began whispering about the evolving balance within Ferrari. The media, too, adjusted its lens. Stories once filled with reverence for Leclerc's vision and potential began to carry more critical undertones. Phrases like a team in transition and internal rebalancing started appearing in headlines. And although no official statements were released, the subtext was clear: Leclerc's dominance within the organization was no longer assumed. Leclerc responded by becoming more assertive in every facet of his involvement. He challenged timing simulations with growing frequency, dissected tire degradation patterns during live sessions, and openly questioned race day calls when they didn't align with his instincts. His tone in post-race interviews shifted. Gone was the subtle charm and composed optimism. In its place was a sharper edge, a sense of urgency tempered by the unmistakable weight of internal pressure. His commitment remained unquestioned, but the spark of confidence that had once defined him now flickered under the surface, dampened by an awareness that the ground beneath him was shifting. Christian Horner, meanwhile, remained characteristically enigmatic. He rarely addressed the topic directly, preferring instead to emphasize collective accountability and the importance of adaptability. Yet his actions carried intent. He championed a philosophy of operational transparency, where decisions were made on the basis of performance metrics rather than historical loyalty. He spoke often of fluid structures and dynamic leadership, subtly signaling a pivot away from the model of centralized influence around a single figure. His public endorsements became more generalized, highlighting the team's versatility rather than any individual's contributions. This ambiguity allowed speculation to thrive while simultaneously protecting the internal evolution from direct scrutiny. Within the walls of the facility, the impact was profound. The workflow adopted a more collaborative rhythm, where no single voice held disproportionate sway. Design revisions were discussed through multidisciplinary panels, simulator trials were conducted with equal input from multiple drivers, and telemetry analyses became increasingly data-centric. Aerodynamic configurations were no longer tailored around familiar baselines. Instead, they were stress-tested for broader compatibility. In effect, the team was becoming more agile, more decentralized, and more difficult to read from the outside. It was a transformation that suited some far more than others. In the midst of this quiet restructuring, Lewis Hamilton was experiencing a rejuvenation that few had anticipated. Once cast as the outsider, the interloper with a decorated past and a complicated legacy, he was now seamlessly integrating into the technical and cultural framework of the team. The trust he felt toward Horner, built slowly through honest dialogue and mutual ambition, allowed him to engage at a depth that had previously eluded him in the twilight of his Mercedes tenure. No longer burdened by the weight of institutional friction or the need to prove his relevance, he immersed himself in the intricacies of development cycles and race preparation. He started arriving earlier to engineering meetings, often the first to review simulator data and the last to leave after strategy briefings. He engaged with aerodynamicists on questions of drag efficiency and downforce thresholds, asked probing questions during software integration sessions, and personally oversaw adjustments to race setup based on evolving track temperatures. His input, far from being ceremonial, was becoming pivotal. And with every session, his relationship with the technical team deepened. They began seeking his feedback proactively, incorporating his observations into mid-season updates, and adjusting development priorities based on his ability to articulate subtle performance imbalances that others couldn't detect. Perhaps most significantly, Hamilton and Horner developed an informal yet potent channel of communication that bypassed traditional structures. They exchanged insights during private strategy calls, debated long-term performance trade-offs over impromptu sit-downs, and built a decision-making cadence rooted in trust and immediacy. This interaction allowed for swift tactical shifts, enabling Ferrari to respond more decisively to on-track developments. It was a partnership not of familiarity, but of evolving respect, two seasoned professionals aligning in pursuit of competitive excellence. The broader team, attuned to this new synergy, began recalibrating accordingly. Sim sessions began to prioritize Hamilton's feedback cycles. Race simulations included fallback options based on his risk assessment preferences. Even the team's media output began subtly reflecting the changing internal hierarchy, positioning Hamilton as a core component of the team's future rather than a temporary fixture of its present. The momentum he brought began translating into tangible improvements: tighter race execution, cleaner stints under pressure, and an uptick in morale among staff who saw in him a driver who still had the fire to elevate those around him. In the eyes of the media, the storyline began shifting as well. The simplistic framing of two alpha drivers vying for supremacy gave way to a deeper narrative, one of evolution, of recalibration, of a team rewriting its DNA in real time. Ferrari was no longer a canvas for Leclerc's ascendance, nor a stage for Hamilton's twilight. It was becoming a battleground of philosophy, where legacy, adaptability, and ambition collided. The implications stretched beyond lap times and podium finishes. They spoke to the future identity of one of motorsport's most iconic teams. And in that quiet but unrelenting transformation, every glance, every meeting, every strategic call carried weight. Nothing was as it had been, and no one remained untouched. Christian Horner's entrance into Ferrari marked the disruption of a deeply ingrained pattern that had long constrained one of the most historic teams in motorsport. He didn't simply arrive with a resume of championships or a reputation built on victories. He brought with him a way of thinking that dismantled conventions and re-engineered the psychological DNA of an organization paralyzed by its own traditions. For years, Ferrari had moved like a grand monument, beautiful, revered, but stubborn and slow to adapt. Decision-making was filtered through layers of hierarchy, creativity suffocated by rigid expectations, and innovation often stalled by the fear of internal judgment. The team existed more as a guardian of its own legacy than as a genuine contender capable of consistent supremacy. What Horner initiated wasn't a change in leadership style, it was a complete recalibration of what Ferrari considered its identity. He understood that structure alone doesn't produce excellence. Results are born from an environment where ambition is allowed to thrive, where dialogue replaces ego, and where the individuals behind the machinery feel empowered to contribute, not simply instructed to obey. Horner stripped away the illusion of control through tradition and replaced it with accountability born from clarity. No more departmental turf wars, no more whispered grievances behind closed doors, just a direct and unified focus on excellence through collaboration. He didn't impose dominance, he inspired alignment. From the factory to the pit wall, trust became the new language. And trust, more than any technological breakthrough, was the first domino in Ferrari's transformation. One of Horner's most pivotal moves was not in the design office or at the strategy desk, but in the driver's seat. Where others saw Lewis Hamilton as a fading icon, Horner recognized the presence of a competitor whose passion had not diminished, only constrained. Hamilton's final seasons at Mercedes had become a study in quiet frustration. Despite his experience and proven record, his instincts were often overridden, his influence diluted by shifting power dynamics, and his hunger subdued by politics masquerading as professionalism. He wasn't slowing down, he was being held back. What he needed was not sympathy or nostalgia, but an honest commitment to unleashing his full potential. Horner didn't offer Hamilton a ceremonial role or a comfortable retirement path. He offered him a battlefield. A place where his feedback would become foundational, his leadership pivotal, and his speed once again central to a team's aspirations. Hamilton responded not with words, but with performance. The partnership between them wasn't built on flattery or past achievements, but on mutual expectations and uncompromising standards. Horner didn't treat him as a past champion, he treated him as a current weapon. Every meeting, every debrief, every simulation session revolved around one core idea, extracting the absolute maximum from every element, and that included the driver. What followed was a subtle but profound renaissance. Hamilton, surrounded by engineers who valued his insights and a team principal who trusted his judgment, began to express himself again, not in interviews or social media posts, but where it mattered most, on track. His approach to racing shifted from reactive to assertive. No longer second-guessing the car beneath him or the motivations of those around him, he returned to attacking apexes with full confidence, calculating tire strategy not just with data but with instinct honed by decades of elite experience. He wasn't out to prove he belonged, he was out to remind everyone why he had once been untouchable. Ferrari, in turn, evolved around him. Horner's influence permeated everything from car development to team morale. Meetings grew sharper, deadlines tighter, and feedback loops faster. There was no room for favoritism or empty promises, only results. And those results began to manifest. Not immediately, not through dramatic overhauls, but gradually, with unmistakable consistency. The gaps to the front narrowed. Race pace improved. Pit stops became precise. And most critically, belief returned, not just in the machinery, but in the mission. What emerged wasn't a nostalgia-fueled redemption arc, but a deliberate, hard-earned resurgence. Hamilton wasn't there to complete a storybook ending. He was there to rewrite the present. Horner didn't promise easy wins or overnight miracles. He built a system that didn't need hope to survive. It relied on preparation, execution, and the refusal to accept mediocrity. Together, they crafted an alliance forged not in comfort, but in challenge. Not out of desperation, but from shared ambition. They didn't revive Ferrari to chase the past, they rebuilt it to dominate the now. And in the cockpit of that red machine, Hamilton no longer carried the weight of unfulfilled potential. He carried momentum, purpose, and an engine built to roar, not whisper.